Hello everybody and welcome to the first ever video in the Great Minds in Philosophy series. This is going to be a series which essentially looks at different philosophers, some of the greatest philosophers throughout history, and attempts to summarize in around 10 or so lessons the most basic and most foundational concepts that they have added to the broader philosophical corpus that we all experience and enjoy reading from to this day. We begin first with the philosopher John Rawls, and in this lesson we are going to take an introduction to the philosophy of John Rawls, the life of Rawls, and some of the basic ideas that he attempted to establish in his life as a philosopher. So, this is going to represent an introduction to the life and the works of John Rawls specifically. Now, John Rawls is one of the most influential political philosophers of the 20th century. Anybody who is studying political philosophy will often come across various classical theories and classical ideas, so the likes of Aristotle, for example. They may go through to looking at some of the ideas of the philosophy relating to the Enlightenment with Rousseau and Kant and John Locke. But then when you get to the 20th century and you get to the modern and contemporary understandings of political philosophy, you will come across individuals such as Robert Nozick and, as is named here, John Rawls. Now, we'll examine his influences, his political ideas, and then also the motivation for his development of a theory of justice, because a theory of justice is essentially the most underlying and most foundational principle that he establishes in his long career. He was born in 1921 and was an American political philosopher within the sort of liberal traditions of the 20th century. We would describe John Rawls as the embodiment of a modern conceptualization of liberalism, especially when we start to look at some of his later works, looking at, for example, his book written on political liberalism, titled aptly Political Liberalism, as well as the ways in which he attempts to internationalize his theory of justice in A Law of Peoples, which we will get to again in future lessons' time. He was born in Baltimore and he studied at Princeton and Cornell, and he would be influenced by a number of political philosophers, but not just political philosophers, but also legal theorists. And so when he was studying at Oxford, he would come across the works and the ideas of legal philosophers such as H.L.A. Hart and other very influential political and legal theorists such as Isaiah Berlin. And you can see some of these ideas sort of enshrined in some of his earlier works. And when we look at a theory of justice and justice as fairness and political liberalism, you'll be able to pick out and point to some of the connections that are made between his ideas within a theory of justice and some of the other liberal traditions that existed around the time as well. So we will be able to see at points some of the influences that H.L.A. Hart and Isaiah Berlin, for example, had on his theories of political philosophy. Now, one of the interesting things that we note when we think about the philosophy of John Rawls is this idea of his religious background. Because originally, John Rawls had a very Christian influence. So he had a Christian background in terms of his upbringing, and there were considerations for him. He considered studying for the priesthood, to actually become a priest, and so obviously to work within religion professionally and formally. And so when we think about this, you could ask the question as the extent to which Christianity plays an influence on his moral and ethical positions. But one of the things that happens is that when Rawls becomes an infantryman during the Second World War, he gets enlisted into the Second World War, he becomes an infantryman, he lost faith after experiencing the horrors of war, as well as coming to an understanding of things like the Holocaust and genocides that took place during the Second World War. Now, this was actually a very common thing that happened to a lot of people. Of course, back in the 1930s and the 1940s, when the Second World War begins, for the most part, the vast majority of people who enlist and sign up within Britain and within the United States were Christian. They had Christian backgrounds, they had Christian faiths, and they practiced Christianity. Now, for some, the horrors of the Second World War played into their beliefs within Christianity and caused them to believe deeper into Christianity as a way of trying to essentially hopefully pray for their souls when they were on the front lines, for example. But for a lot of people, it caused them to lose faith because of the fact that the Second World War was an incredibly evil event, essentially. It showed the evils of mankind, it showed the evils and the horrors of war, especially things like the Holocaust as well. And so it would make a lot of people think, well, Christianity surely cannot exist or be a correct interpretation of the world because of the fact that these horrors were able to happen. And that kind of losing of faith was one of the things that John Rawls experienced when fighting during the Second World War. But his fighting also during the Second World War would influence his later political activism, because he spoke out against, for example, the draft for the Vietnam War, and was on the front lines in terms of real avid critics of both the Vietnam War itself and the draft for conscripting soldiers to go to the war in Vietnam. Vietnam, of course, being an incredibly controversial conflict compared to that of the Second World War. So those are the kinds of basic influences that we can examine. Now, Rawls's magnum opus would essentially be his theory relating to a conception of a just society. And Rawls's work influences political philosophy to this day. So, like I said, his magnum opus, his most foundational work, is the 1971 book, A Theory of Justice. This is the first work which conceptualized his theory of a just liberal society. We will talk in a lot of detail about A Theory of Justice, quite heavily from A Theory of Justice. And if you have a copy of A Theory of Justice, I recommend reading it. It's a very, very, very good work of philosophy. And it's also for anybody who wants to be a philosopher or work in academia as philosophers, or engage in any kind of philosophy or political theory. A Theory of Justice is, in my opinion, one of the best books to read to get an understanding of how best to write philosophy and political theory, because it is very, very well written in terms of explanations. Just contrast Rawls as The Theory of Justice to works by people like Karl Marx or Hegel or Kant, some of the earlier people who, of course, are very, very confusing in their works. Now, this would be the resulting work for the remainder of his life. So essentially, A Theory of Justice set the foundation for his theory of justice, for her theory of a conceptualized, just liberal society. And the rest of his life, he would contribute to and add and improve his idea and understanding of A Theory of Justice. So we have in 1990 the release of a book on political liberalism, which works on building upon the foundational principles established in A Theory of Justice. We then get The Law of Peoples in 1999, which is an attempt to essentially internationalize A Theory of Justice. A lot of critiques were had against Rawls's theory of justice in the sense that it is limited to the confines of the state. And given the fact that the 1970s, we see the work of Charles Beats's book on political theory and international relations, and then we see in the 1990s and the early 2000s the growing literature on this idea of global justice, with the philosophers such as Thomas Poggers and people by the name of people like Peter Singer, for example, all critiquing this very state-centric, limited theory of justice, while Rawls attempts to explain and to counter those critiques with A Law of Peoples, which reimagines his theory of justice but applied to the global world. We then also get Justice as Fairness, a book that is written in 2001, towards the end of his life. Now, what is interesting about Justice as Fairness is it is, again, a further conceptualization and a further reformulation of his theory of justice, taking all of the critiques that had been levied against him and attempting to respond, to improve, to alter the theory of justice in such a way as to really create a final work that is described as the conceptualized theory of a just liberal society. So with that being said, and with this background covered, I want to just quickly go over the course of this series, essentially the lessons that we're going to be covering. We're going to spend some time examining essentially the most influential elements of Rawlsian theories of justice. We'll talk first about Rawls's political philosophy. So this takes us one step away from a theory of justice, just takes us outside of that remit for a second and talks about political philosophy more broadly, and talks about the positions and the starting points and the conceptualizations that Rawls has in relation to political theory, which then we can apply to his theories of justice, focusing first on justice as fairness, talking about the original position, the way in which the original position formulates a theory of justice and gives practical application to a theory of justice, with the original position in conjunction with the veil of ignorance. We'll talk about the work on political liberalism, and then we will finish by talking about the internationalization of a theory of justice, talking about how Rawls approaches global justice and international relations, and talk about some of the key appraisals and critiques that can be had in that regard as well.